What endures longer? The stone crowns of kings ground to dust by time, or the oath whispered in the cold, sealed with breath that mists in night air. The tale of the wall begins not with power or greed, but with fear, a fear so deep, so bone-born, that men joined hands to raise a barrier unlike any other in the world. Ice taller than mountain shoulders. A rampart frozen in the marrow of the land. The wall, silent, watchful, eternal. Or so it was meant to be. Ancient singers whisper a boy who carried the name Bran the Builder, a dreamer who gazed upon the northern wastes and shaped stone, timber, and ice into bulwarks no storm nor shadow could easily break. Some call him a myth, some a king's son, others little more than a symbol that time embellished. Yet his work, whether mortal or mythic, still stands, the greatest frontier in all the realms of men. But what use is a wall without guardians? What oath can hold men upright when darkness returns unseen? Thus arose the Night's Watch, a brotherhood bound not by birthright or crown, but by vow. Its words were carved into the marrow of Westeros. Men, be they lords, sons, or thieves, were made equal beneath the shadow of the wall, sworn to hold back what lies beyond. And beyond, they said, lingered not only the free folk, fierce and untamed, but stories far older, of the cold ones, the white shadows that walked in silence, and of their king, the Night King, half legend, half nightmare. The wall is not just stone and frost. It is memory. It is warning. It is a graveyard of forgotten battles, and the last refuge of those the world casts aside. Here begins the long chronicle of its keepers. No man alive has seen its first stone laid, nor its final block of ice set. Yet all echo the name whispered as its maker, Bran Stark, called Bran the Builder. His figure drifts between record and legend, dressed sometimes in the garb of a boy prince, other times as a simple child who raised his gaze to the sky and found in its immensity the vision of a barrier to rival it. In the songs, his hands bear no scars, no calluses. Instead, his labor conducted through wisdom, friendship with giants, and strange compacts with beings long vanished from memory. But whether through mortal feet or by powers outside the grasp of men, a wall was made, and it was no ordinary wall. It rose of ice, impossibly tall, cresting into the clouds, so that the sun itself seemed sliced in two when viewed from its shadow. Some claim sorcery says foundations, spells interwoven with stone and frost, blood etched into its bones to keep away the others, the white demons of snow who moved only by silence. In darker tales, dragon fires sealed the ice in place, the breath of some forgotten beast mingling with mortal work, until a whole structure became something more than either pure sorcery or simple architecture. The wall stretched 300 miles across northern wilderness, a line so astonishing that travelers from the far reaches of Essos dismissed it as fable. Men crossing under its gates could feel it shiver in their teeth, as though the wall itself snarled against intruders in unseen tongues of ice. Its height defied comprehension. 700 feet in its beginning, dwarfing castles and mountainsides, a sentinel frozen into permanence. Yet permanence is an illusion, as history often reminds. What power compels a people to spend blood and years raising such a dream in frost? Only memory stiffened their hands, the shadow of the long night, when the world had once been plunged into endless darkness and cold, when creatures called others slid through villages like silver wraiths, their hands extinguishing flame as if fire itself bent to their chill. Humanity was nearly broken, saved only through fire, dragonglass, and valor. The wall served not simply as a shield of ice, but as the enduring scar of catastrophe, so that men never forgot what crawled from the frozen wastes. Many maesters puzzle over how such magnitude was achieved in an age of wooden palisades and stone rings. Some insist giants bent their towering shoulders to haul blocks of ice, their primitive strength guided by Bran's cunning. Others whisper that the children of the forest play spells deep within the frost, their weirwood magic binding the seams so tight no ordinary thaw could shake them. Perhaps this alliance of man, giant, and child is the truest heart of the wall, not the monument itself, but the unity briefly forged to ensure survival. Yet, what is built must be watched, for walls, no matter how formidable, are not sentient things. They require memory, vigilance, and the will to stand guard when generations grow forgetful. Bran may be remembered as builder, but he was also a steward of warning, to guard, not only with ice, but with unyielding men who would take the burden upon themselves. Thus, in the shadow of his creation, the seeds of another legacy began to form. As frost still settled upon the wall's unfinished stretches, oaths were murmured, first by lords, then by their sons, then by men with little else to give but their lives. What Bran built in monument, others resolved to honor in flesh. In time, this assembly, fragile and uncertain, will become something far greater. It will become the Night's Watch. Out of the shadow of Bran's great wall there arose not merely a structure of frost and stone, but a question that demanded an answer. Who would stand beside it when the cold winds rose again? A barrier, no matter how vast, was a mute relic unless men gave it sight, voice, and blade. Thus in those first years after the raising of the wall, when the long night's memories still troubled the dreams of kings and small folk alike, the first brothers gathered in solemn pact. They were not forged of one kind. Some were warriors of noble birth, the sons of houses who had fought the others with fire and steel. Some were wanderers who sought no lord, yet retained a will to live in service of something greater than coin or kin. Still more were broken men, survivors of the chaos who had little else left to give except themselves. What bound them was not name but vow, the understanding that within these frozen ramparts, all were leveled into equals. In time, the name of this brotherhood would stretch beyond their borders. The Night's Watch. Their earliest ranks were few, but they were seasoned by necessity. Rangers set forth into the stormed wilderness to chart the land and measure the silence beyond the wall. Builders laid stone and timber where the great ice needed fortifying. Stewards maintained food, ravenry, and order in lean conditions where winter always lingered even in summer's heart. Already could be seen the shape of an institution not merely martial, but complex, a life unto itself, sustained by duty in the face of cold indifference. The watch was, at its inception, an honored calling. Kings pledged their kin, and lords gave tribute in the form of men and supplies. To swear the black was not a shameful exile, but a path of dignity, celebrated in song, and given honor by those who dwelt behind the wall's protection. Membership tore one from inheritance, land, and legacy, but filled that gap with strange, severe splendor, to be one with the realm of night, whose wife was duty and whose children were memory itself. The brotherhood thrived on this ethos, and for a time their ranks swelled not with outcasts but with the chosen. Their strongholds multiplied. Along the vast expanse of the wall rose near 20 castles, each a fort of stone, ice, and timber set close enough to communicate, and yet far enough to patrol broad swaths of frontier. Eastwatch by the sea, where cold winds tasted of salt and tides, the Shadow Tower at the far west with a wall-brushed mountain, Castle Black, humble but central, its fires burning to warm the long road. These were more than garrisons. They were shrines of vigilance. So, too, did order emerge among the brothers. A Lord Commander, chosen by the voices of all, ruled over the darkened host, his authority respected across nobility and peasantry alike. Below him, The first ranger, the Lord Steward, and the Lord Builder formed a triad of pillars to support structure within the chaos of wilderness. A unique democracy of duty, where even the lowest born might, by merit and proof, ascend to sitting command over High Scion and Lordling. In this, the Watch reflected not the realm of men, but something both harsher and perhaps purer. Songs say the early Lord Commanders were men of unyielding sternness, ironable rather than a cruelty. They had to be so, for their numbers were still too few, and the walls stood as both shield and temptation. A lord of the free folk beyond who raided not merely for food, but for blood and vengeance. How many names were lost to the winds of that first century can never be known. Maesters scour chronicles for record, yet even their precise ink concedes defeat to the cold. Still, the pattern emerges. The wall attracted, bound, and consumed those who swore to it. It is often forgotten in later days, when the Watch shrank into a place of thieves and bastard sons, that its origin was luminous in esteem, to wear the black cloak was to forsake self for posterity of species. Fathers sent sons and felt pride whispering through grief. Mothers prayed to the Seven, or to weirwoods, that their children would join the immortal line of guardians. The wall in its youth was not a ruin, but a monument alive with fire, black banners stiff in the gale, and eyes ever turned outward toward the sinister dark. And yet always lingered doubt, twisting like mist across the tundra. Did the others, defeated in the long night, sleep still beneath permafrost? Would they rise again? Some dismiss the oath as overzealous caution, a relic of a myth-filled world. Others held that even should no pale fiend stalk the forest evermore, still, men would attack the wall. Wild tribes, scattered clans, kings beyond the frozen rivers. 1,000 nameless. Hungry threats might surge south if ever the brotherhood faltered. So the first brothers lived as if tomorrow bore the long night's return, and their memory of Bran's labor steeled their hands. From those foundations sprouted an oath, words that anchor their frozen existence. In silence of frost and firelight, those words would be shaped into the marrow-striking promise that became the heart of the Watch itself. It is impossible to speak of the Night's Watch without speaking of the words that bind it, for words gave shape to men's resolve when the wall's shadow felt too vast. Their oath was more than a promise to stand guard. It was a renunciation of all other lives they might have led. Though the exact phrasing takes differing forms in Old Tongue and later common speech, the sense is the same. The Brotherhood is their family now, the wall their home, and the night their eternal companion. Some speculate the first oath was born not from maesters or nobles, but from the brothers themselves. Rough men huddled near torchlight, carving words out of equal parts desperation and resolve. What the oath accomplished was an act of alchemy more powerful than sorcery. It erased identity. Nobles stood equal with poachers, lords with beggars. Wealth and lineage evaporated the moment a man uttered the words and felt the weight of a heavy black cloak fall across his shoulders. From then on, all that remained was duty. Forsaking wife and children was not cruelty but necessity, for ties of blood draw loyalty elsewhere. A lord with land south of the wall, if still bound by inheritance, could be bent to betray winter's vigilant cause. A peasant, tempted by hunger to break ranks, might harm more than himself by fleeing. Thus the oath severed them from yesterday, so their tomorrow might be unclouded by divided allegiance. For some, this renunciation was as painful as death. For others, those fleeing punishment, shame, or the cold hatred of kin, it was a rebirth. And yet, the Watch was not joyless in its ritual. Though stripped of property and claim, the act of swearing was steeped in solemn dignity. By torch or godswood, tyrant or thief, all bent in a ceremony designed to endure in the marrow. In the earliest days, men swore before heart trees, whose carved faces soaked in every word, believing the old gods themselves stood witness. Later, as the seven gained worshippers, these strangers to the first men also bore holy witness. The Watch tolerated this mingling, for there could be no division in faith when all bent equally before the wall. To swear upon a heart tree, or accept flickering candles, or the star-speckled sky itself, it mattered less which god's gaze fell on the speaker than that the words took root in the soul. Over centuries the oath took on the weight of Scripture. It was memorized not because parchment demanded it, but because it became the creed of the brotherhood's essence. When doubts crept in, men whispered those lines back to themselves like a prayer against the cold. When fear weakened the heart, it drove men not outward into flight, but inward into resolve. It was a chain willingly worn, a yoke of eternal night accepted as life's highest honor. For as long as the words endured, even when flesh faltered, the memory of the Watch held steady. The oath shaped culture as well as conduct. Brothers did not inherit fathers' feuds nor mothers' names. They stood unburdened. It smoothed disputes. Grudges became senseless, for what mattered were the Watch's needs, not southern squabbles. Men who once would never share table or tent, knight and bastard, murderer and craven, became bound by their shared words, finding a strange eternity in that abandonment of self. That such a system, harsh though it was, endured for thousands of years testifies to the power of binding words spoken at dawn or dusk in frostic air. It is said an oath becomes strongest when tested. The Watch's oath was tested first by hunger, then by wildling steel, and finally by silence. Silence of generations forgetting why the words were ever necessary. For in time, the legends of pale demons subsided into myth. The long night receded into a half-trusted tale, and men behind the wall began to believe their guardians fought shadows that had long been extinguished. The oath still stood. Cloaks were still sworn, but belief in the urgency behind it waned. Still, on snowy nights when the wind cut through castle keeps and the aurora painted its eerie light across the wall's sleeping face, men felt the truth of their vows settle upon their shoulders like unseen hands. For every oath is a bridge between past and present, fear and resolve, life and the unknowable dark. It was as if the wall itself listened each time a boy bent knee, and in listening gave strength. In the centuries after its founding, this oath became the marrow from which all else flowed. The way camps were ordered, the way disputes were settled, the way lives were measured, whether in glory or failure. From it rose valorous rangers who crossed the frozen rivers into mystery. From it fell broken brothers who deserted and perished in snow. And in its echo lies every chapter that will follow, the rise and fall of commanders, the struggles of kings, the endless dance with wildlings, and the whispered terror of the other's pale return. And so, with the oath carved into their beings, the Watch grew, yet shadows lengthened, and there remained foes not of snow, but of nightmare. Whispers of beings beyond human comprehension still lingered in firelit halls, unbanished by the passage of centuries. These whispers grew to tales, and those tales to legends bound about a name that carried fear across ages. The others, and in their dark wake, the specter of a king clad not in flesh, but in endless winter. The oath gave brothers purpose. The wall gave them shelter. But what truly haunted their nights, what justified the endless cold, the endless watchfulness, were the stories of those beyond the human fold. For while men clashed steel with free folk, and lords contested thrones far to south, there lingered an older terror that no crown could tame, the others. If the long night left behind scars, the others were its deepest wound. Legend described them as tall, slender beings, white of hair and frostbound in appearance, whose eyes gleamed the impossible blue of heartstones frozen under starlight. Their very presence stole warmth. Torches sputtered into useless smoke, steel shattered as if rotten with age, and men felt courage slip from their bones before blade was drawn. Legends say they spoke a language like cracking ice, cruel and alien, a sound that unmoored hearts. Yet no record remains of their true origin, nor what power brought them into being or bound them to the endless darkness. Most chroniclers act as though they flickered briefly into existence only for the long night, then was shattered as dawn pierced the world once more. Yet if memory demanded a wall, if Bran the Builder went to such extremes, if kings swore their sons into perpetual service, then perhaps the others were not a mere interlude in history, but its constant shadow. Few could say what they wanted. Fewer still could understand their silence. Were they conquerors bent on claiming dominion? Spirits of vengeance for a world defiled by men's axes and fires? Or remnants of natural order, as old as winter itself, seeking only to smother the unnatural flame of humankind? The stories preserved across centuries are contradictory, their details warped by time. In some, the others traveled in silent armies, their ranks filled with corpses raised anew, deathless puppets serving their icy masters. In others, they were few but unassailable, scattering men as wolves scatter sheep. Hunters tell of dragging blood-slicked bodies back to camp only to rise again with glassy blue eyes, killing companions before vanishing back into the blizzard. Mothers frightened children into slumber with whispers that pale riders came for those who wander beyond candlelight. Perhaps most striking and most contested of all tales were their weaknesses. Fire, ever a fragile tool of man, stood as their bane, though flame in the high north is fickle and fleeting. Dragonglass, volcanic stone born of fire and earth's torment, is said to pierce their unnatural skin where steel shatters. So too the metal called Valyrian steel, forged in spells and dragon fire, whose scarcity made it precious indeed. If these truths hold, they speak to the other's true nature, not of flesh and blood, but of shifting sorcery, bound less to sinew than element. Maesters often dismiss such stories as superstition, chalking them to snow fever or desperate hallucination amidst endless white storms. Yet the Night's Watch did not scoff. Though centuries might pass without a single sighting, their training embedded old truths in every ranger. Carry dragonglass if you find it, light fire where you can, and never treat the frostbitten corpse of a fallen brother lightly. Death among the Watch held grim rituals, for fear the body might not remain at peace. In this manner, myth pervaded not only song but practice. The Watch lived half in reality and half in preparation for that impossible return. The others became phantoms ever present yet never seen, the embodiment of every fear Frost whispered in a man's uncertain heart. Even when their terror waned in the common man's memory, to the Watch there remained constant specters. And it was this tension, the South believing them gone, the Watch refusing to forget, that nourished one of the greatest divisions between northern frontier and southern kingdom, where one saw silence, the other saw a looming storm. And in the quiet centuries when they did not emerge, it became easier to doubt, easier to forget. Tales of the others passed into fireside ghost stories, their horror recast as half fables, half myth, until the solemn battles of the long night felt as distant as the age of heroes itself. Yet the Watch continued, the oath unbroken, because a brother in black could never afford such convenience. For even if 1,000 winters passed without a pale shadow crossing the snow, all it would take was one more dawnless night to end an age of men. Thus the others never needed to march southward in endless legions to sway history. Their true legacy was silence and scar. the eternal reminder that horror may rest, but cannot be slain by forgetfulness. And because men are so eager to forget, the watch endured, silent, cold, unyielding, as both shield and memory. But if memory alone were their foe, the watch might have endured forever. Memory, however, is nothing against hunger, steel, and fire. There remain foes both flesh and blood. Foes who did not walk as legends but as men, yet who tested the wall just as endlessly as the pale shadows of old. For beyond the icy rampart dwelled the free folk, innumerable tribes driven by survival, fury, and the simple desire for freedom. Between them and the watch, conflict would spill again and again, bloodying the snow for centuries. The land remembers in ways men cannot. Winds twist with echoes older than kingdoms. Trees hold memory in their rings. Ice bears scars of winters past. Yet for humankind, the long night is more legend than history, its truths frozen beneath the snow drifts of memory. The watch was born from that cataclysm, the wall raised as bulwark against it. Yet the details blur across song and tale, as though even memory quailed before reciting the full terror. What is known or believed is this: there was a time when day did not dawn. The sun vanished behind endless shadow, and the earth plunged into cold without end. Crops withered, rivers froze, and cities were buried in waves of snow. From the barren wastes rode the others, pale riders cutting swathes through mankind's fragile settlements. They did not kill alone. They raised what they killed, filling their armies not by bloodlines but by corpses. Men who fell one night were arrayed as foes by morning, their lifeless eyes gleaming blue in torchlight. Fire became salvation. Villages who clung to flame endured longer. Kings who gathered dragonglass and valor stood a chance. Battles of that age are scarcely remembered in detail, but the scale of devastation reverberates across every culture. The children of the forest, that dwindling kin of old sorcery, fought alongside men, whispering spells into forests and guiding ravens on desperate wings. And somewhere beneath northern skies, a last stand was made that saw the others driven back, winter broken and daylight restored. Yet victory was not absolution. When shadows receded, men faced a world forever scarred. Carven into their bones remained terror so great that Bran the Builder raised his impossible wall. The Brotherhood of the Night's Watch emerged not for a season, but eternal. And though ordinary folk settled back into lives of tilling fields and tilting spears at rival lords, a line of men remained at their frozen post century after century, sworn to remember what others chose to forget. And here lies tragedy. Memory is fleeting, faith weaker still. As seasons passed, the long night slipped from history into tale, then from tale into fable. In Essos it lived on as stories of night lands, of the great other warring against Lawler, god of light. In Westeros it became bedtime tale, mothers crooning of pale shadows to hush their children's cries. Even noble courts questioned if it had ever truly come to pass. Only the Black brothers clung to its memory, repeating and retelling until the chants of the long night became their marrow. Some maesters point to cyclical patterns, winters that repeat with eerie severity, storms that eclipse entire regions, as evidence that the long night was not myth, but history repeating in slumbering rhythm. Others argue it was mere catastrophe, volcanic ash choking sunlight for years, or a shift in the sphere's balance dragging the world into frozen dark. Such arguments matter little to the Watch, for whether caused with sorcery or natural calamity, its consequence was indisputable. Humanity had nearly ended in frost, and so mortal duty demanded prevention of its return. What endured most was not the details of battle, but the fear. Fear that the others might not be destroyed, but merely waiting. Fear that endless winter could descend without warning. fear that men, softened over generations, would not be ready. This dread was the true reason the Watch endured. Kings rose and fell, dynasties shattered, Southron courts squabbled over thrones, but the Watch stood, repeating silently across centuries, "Remember, do not forget." The aftermath of the long night shaped not only institutions, but belief. The oath, the wall, the whole structure of the Brotherhood spoke to a singular truth. Human arrogance must be curbed, for survival requires humility. This creed quietly guided the Watch even as others ignored it. They never claimed glory. They asked no crown for thanks. Their very existence became monument enough. Still, darkness leaves traces deeper than frost. In the centuries following the long night, whispers flourished of one who wielded power like none other. Tales diverge. Some speak of a 12th Lord Commander, some of a figure cursed yet mighty, others of a king clad in night itself. His name has been lost to record, drenched in snow and fear, but across the ages one title remained to color his legend: the Night King. A man or myth, betrayer or invention, his story would haunt the Watch like the long shadow of the others themselves, a reminder that danger comes not only from beyond the wall, but sometimes from within its guardians. Thus, from a horror of the long night, two legacies walked forward together, resilient against that which lay beyond, and unease at what secrets might fester within the Black Brotherhood's own walls. Both threads would entwine, tangle, and unravel across the millennia of the Watch's story. Even as the snow settled from the long night's passing, men whisper the stranger who crowned a corpse to be his queen, and by doing so bound death itself to his will. As the sorrows of memory faded for common folk, a darker tale began to grow that would forever mark the lore of the Watch. Among the fragments of memory left scattered after the long night, none has provoked more fear, more debate, or more uneasy silence than that of the Night King. His tale is told in whispers, with voices lowered even in firelit safety, and though maesters have written much in skepticism, the story lingers stubbornly in the marrow of northern lore. Some say he was the 13th man to bear command over the Night's Watch, faithful brother who let his gaze wander not only outward into the snows, but inward into hungers forbidden. Others claim he was no brother at all, but a figure out of nightmare woven into the Watch's annals to frighten recruits into obedience. And yet, why would so many versions of so grim a tale persist if there were not some awful seed within it? The tale most often repeated is this: long after the wall was raised, after the darkest memories of the long night had begun to fade, the Watch was led by a Lord Commander of great strength and stern resolve. But the man was not content. Power can touch even those sworn to forsake it, and in his wandering patrols he beheld a woman unlike any known among humankind. She was described as pale as moonlight, her beauty both wondrous and terrible, her skin cold as ice, and her eyes the piercing shine of the others. Where she walked, frost lingered. Where she spoke, lesser wills bent. He fell for her, not with the ordinary ardor of men, but as though ensnared. Some say she bewitched him, others that he went willingly into her thrall. Whatever the truth, he brought her back beyond the gates, to the ancient fortress called the Night Fort. There he proclaimed her his queen and himself her king, seating himself not as servant of the wall, but as Lord of Night. Together they ruled, bending brothers to their will, twisting old oaths, and perhaps worse, offering human sacrifice to the cold god said to linger beyond the wall's end. For 13 years his reign endured, the Night's Watch corrupted, its purpose undone. Frost and shadow seeped into the Night Fort, and the figure who had once sworn to protect the realm became instead its terror. The accounts diverge on whether he sought to carve for himself dominions stretching south of the wall, or whether his reign remained confined to the cursed stronghold. Yet all agreed that unless he were stopped, his power would grow until no flame remained unquenched. At last, his tyranny stirred the living to rebellion. In that rare moment, the two great powers of the North, House Stark of Winterfell and the wild tribes who called themselves free folk, set aside hatred long enough to act as one. When legends note this alliance, their gravity becomes clear. Eternal foes, divided by the wall itself, raised weapons not against one another, but against a man who now bore the name of Night King. Together, they stormed the Night Fort. What battles were fought within, what creatures lurked in its frozen halls, what spells perhaps shattered and burned, all are lost. What remains is only certainty. The Night King fell, and with his fall the Watch was cleansed, its vows reclaimed as sacred. In the aftermath, his very name was struck from memory. Some accounts insist his lineage was Stark, a shame deliberately erased to preserve Winterfell's honor. Others point to the Blackwoods, others to lesser houses, others still to nameless obscurity. Silence, however, often speaks more loudly than remembrance. That lords and maesters alike agreed to bury his identity attests to the fear of what might be unleashed if the truth were known. The wise understood this. Names endure. If his name remained, so too might his shadow. Yet silence breeds its own power. The story persisted because men repeat what terrifies them most. To the Watch, it became a parable. Beware the lure of shadow. Beware forgetting that even brothers can fall. To the free folk, it became proof of the Watch's hypocrisy, that even their self-proclaimed guides were not immune to corruption. To the South, when heard at all, it was dismissed as myth, just another tale to chill wine-soaked feasts. The Night King's tale thus occupies a strange place in history. It is both warning and myth, both suppressed and remembered, both undeniable and fictionalized beyond recognition. Perhaps there was no icy queen, no enthrallment, only a cruel Lord Commander gone rogue. Perhaps the sorcery was real and his pale bride something of the others themselves, binding him in a union of death and ice. In either truth or half-truth, the Watch bore scars, and the Night Fort, cradle of the Brotherhood's earliest traditions, grew cursed in whisper. Even long after, brothers avoided its halls. Stone cracked, icicles fanged, and emptiness seemed fuller there, as if the litter of that terrible chapter lived forever in frozen stone. Only the boldest would sleep within its walls, and even then, seldom without unease. What is certain is this: the Night King taught by horror and rebellion that the Watch must ever guard against corruption not only from the North, but within its own heart. Discipline, humility, and the oath were not merely guides but necessities. Lest another Lord Commander lose himself to ambition, lest the Wall Watch itself crumble into treachery. And so, from the shadows of legend, the Night King's story tightened the bond of vow. If the long night established why the wall must stand, the Night King reminded why its keepers must always remember they are mortal, fallible, and bound only by duty. Yet memory cannot silence hunger, nor prevent strife. For though myths of ice whispered of supernatural foes, the Watch would meet, across its long centuries, a far more constant and brutal foe: other men. If the long night was a Watch's ancient nightmare and the Night King its cautionary tale, then the endless struggle of the free folk was its daily existence, a rhythm of conflict that endured for thousands of years. Unlike shadows out of legend, the free folk required no imagination to fear. They were as real as the winter wind that slashed the cheeks of every ranger. To the people of the South, they were wildlings, a term devised to strip them of honor, to categorize them as savage, lesser, unworthy of the civility of walled towns and crowned kings. Yet beyond the wall, they named themselves a free folk, and in those words lay truth enough. They bent knee no lord, pledged no fealty to throne nor crown. For this refusal, they became both enemy and perpetual foil to the Night's Watch. Generation after generation, raids carried southward brought fire and steel to northern villages. Harsh winters drove them from their frozen highlands. Hunger burned them out of their caves, and ambition, sometimes noble, sometimes ruinous, hurled them against the wall. To the Watch, they were an unending tide, testing garrisons, seizing cattle, burning crofts. To the free folk, the wall was the insult carved into land itself, a barrier erected by strangers to keep them trapped in cold exile. In one story, humanity had endured together against the others. In another, that unity fractured with ice piled high to divide man from man. Thus war, in many forms, never ceased. Some conflicts were scattered skirmishes, easily repelled by well-trained rangers. Others blossomed into vast migrations, whole tribes moving as nations, hammering their strength against black brothers outnumbered but resolute. Some winters saw only minor clashes. Others saw blood staining the snows from East Watch to Shadow Tower. The Watch recorded dozens of kings beyond the wall, leaders who rose to unify tribes for a time, swelling their numbers into armies that could briefly threaten the rampart of ice. Each such king sought passage south, not always in conquest, but often in search of survival. The likes of Bael the Bard, Jarl the Bitter, and eventually Mance Rayder each carved their legends in attempted crossing. Each tested the mettle of the Watch, reminding the Brotherhood that though pale demons might sleep, humanity's hungers never rested. One of the earliest remembered invasions was led by a warlord known only as Gendel, a chief whose raw cunning drew clans together under his songs of defiance. He led thousands in open assault upon the Black Gate, the hidden gate by which the Watch sometimes passed beneath the wall. Beside him stood his brother, Gorn. The Gendel-Gorn expedition nearly succeeded, and in its aftermath, creation of stricter protections around the hidden gate confirmed the seriousness of such threats. The free folk were not fractured fools. They were people with leaders, songs, and purpose. Time and again this pattern repeated. A king united the tribes, pressed south with winters at his back, and for a time the Watch trembled, forced to fight not shadow but fire and steel. When defeat came, the unity dissolved. Tribes bickered once more, scattered to their valleys and frozen rivers, and the wall endured, but never for long. Inevitably, desperation gathered them again, and the Watch's vigilance could never waver, for tomorrow's horizon might carry smoke. Life on the wall thus became not only a solemn vigil for inhuman foe, but also a ceaseless struggle against their own kind. The free folk's ferocity sharpened the Watch as much as frost. Rangers learned stealth not to stalk pale rays, but to shadow war bands. Builders repaired more damage from flaming arrow than supernatural frost. And stewards managed lean stores stretched to feed men after battles in which wounded doubled mouths and halved strength. These wars bred not only hardship but respect, too, though it was seldom admitted openly. Many brothers of the Watch, in quieter moments, acknowledged free folk courage and resilience. To survive where winters are crueler than any South man could endure, without lords or maesters, demanded fortitude. That same ferocity, turned against the wall, often awed even those sworn to bar their way. Yet for every whisper of respect came also bitterness. Brothers died in raids, villages were burned, children abducted. For the Northmen living south of the wall, defenses against the free folk were not theories of loyalty, but matters of blood. To them, the Watch was their protector against endless grievance. Kings in winter, Starks of ages past, aligned with the Brotherhood to keep the wall armed and supplied, for they knew the free folk pressed against them as much as against the rest of Westeros. In truth, no great battle with the free folk ever ended the story. There was no final moment, no victory so decisive that it quelled future raids. There was only rhythm, a dance across centuries. Raids, defenses, blood, retreat, silence, swelling anew. This constancy wore upon the watch. For unlike the others, who remained mythic in their absence, the free folks' presence eroded morale, turned vigilance into weary repetition. The oath grew heavy not only in endless waiting, but in endless fighting of kin who looked far too much like themselves. But within these endless wars, greater figures stirred. Kings whose dreams soar beyond mere plunder and into destiny. Among them none loomed greater than Mance Rayder, singer and swordsman, man who had once sworn the very oath that bound black brothers, only to abandon it and emerge as the most formidable king beyond the wall in memory. His rise marked the culmination of centuries of tribal strife. His unification of clans a storm unlike any the wall had seen in ages. And it would fall not in ancient days, but in the time of the bastard boy brought to the watch in shame, who would one day carve his mark as Lord Commander. The Night's Watch, for all its steadfast brotherhood, has always been defined most sharply by the men who wore the mantle of its command. The Lord Commander is no crowned monarch, nor is he elected by bloodline. His authority stems instead from the raised hands of his sworn brothers, an election of necessity rather than grandeur. Yet history shows us that the men who rose to that post shaped the fate of the Watch as profoundly as any king shaped the destiny of a realm. Some commanded with wisdom and endurance, guiding their brothers through winters long and lean. Some with iron fists and ruthless pragmatism, holding fractious men together by fear. A few, remembered only in bitterness, faltered, and the shadow of their failures nearly unmade the order sworn to eternal watchfulness. The earliest Lord Commanders were men of legend, their names half-shrouded like Bran the Builder himself. In the centuries following the wall's foundation, the first leaders bore the charge of creation, ensuring that the Watch's castles were manned, its supply lines tethered to southern lords, its sense of duty enduring even as distant kings grew careless. It cannot be underestimated how difficult their task was. To build not merely a fort, but an institution is to command faith out of famine, resolve out of doubt, and still they succeeded. For several centuries, their rule was honored across Winterfell's lords. The kings of Winter recognized that the Watch was not an idle ornament, but a living defense, and so the stark overlords of the North often sent sons and kin to serve, binding noble blood with the Black Cloak. The prestige of the office meant that to be chosen Lord Commander was not merely to lead men in wilderness, but to stand as one of the most respected figures in Westeros. In that age, a Lord Commander's word could sway lords south of the neck, and his voice carried heavily in southern councils. Yet the mantle was not carried lightly. Consider the memory of Harlan the Hunter, who in the 2nd century of the Watch's history vanquished a great host of raiders led by Bael the Bard himself. Harlan endured weeks of attrition, rationing food, forcing brothers to march half-starved through drifts taller than men, all to hold back a tidal host that tested every stone in Castle Black. He won, but at the cost of nearly half the Watch's strength in his own life, perishing from fever 2 nights after declaring victory. To later generations, he exemplified that eternal paradox. The Lord Commander's triumph and his doom so often came together. Another remembered figure was Commander Osric Snow, bastard son of Winterfell, who distinguished himself for his diplomacy as much as his sword. For decades in the 8th century after Aegon's conquest, Osric forged uneasy truces with clans of free folk, allowing trade of grain for furs in times of lean harvest. Such choices were controversial among his brothers, but prolonged their survival during winters harsher than any since the Long Night. Osric's legacy, however, became cautionary. After his death, truces collapsed and suspicion turned once more to bloodshed. From his tale came an unspoken lesson. Lord's commander could not only wield a sword, but also decide how close suspicion and mercy should lie upon a blade's edge. Between commanders of valor lay the forgotten, men who ruled briefly, scribbled in ink-smudged annals with years empty of notable event, their reigns remembered more by famine than by glory. And alongside them stood darker names, men who gave the Black Brotherhood shame. From their veins came tales like that of the Night King, when leadership became corruption. Not every failure bred sorcery, but some bred cruelty, neglect, or cowardice, all cracks that threatened to break the watch from within. Particularly grim was the brief reign of Runsel Hightower, centuries after Aegon's landing. A proud scion of Old Town who had chosen the black rather than family inheritance, Runsel sought to rule the Watch as though it were feudal court, elevating men of noble descent. He cast aside criminals and low-born to menial duties, ignoring their merit. His favoritism bred division so severe that his brothers eventually rose against him in mutiny. He was slain in his chambers, his name struck with dishonor. Runsel's folly left an enduring seed, the reminder that within the Watch, the cloak erased bloodlines, and any who forgot it risked their lives. The election of each Lord Commander was itself ritual steeped in tension. Brothers cast their votes not based solely on noble blood or reputation, but upon trust forged in snow and battle. The camps often aligned. Rangers for warriors, builders for those who valued stone and survival, stewards for those of practical hands. Political intrigue existed even here, but unlike southern courts, the stakes were blunt and immediate: hunger, cold, and the lives of men. A commander not equal to the task could not rely on diplomacy, only on the obedience of those who followed him into the frost. And yet, for all their legends, some of the greatest Lords Commander are unnamed, their deeds forgotten, their fortitudes unrecorded. How many winters passed unbroken because of decisions made in silence? How many small victories? Patrols returned safe, outposts held, supplies rationed with precision, prevented disaster but never caught fire within song. Those must be remembered in spirit, if not by name. For the truest legacy of the Lord Commander lies not in greatness, but in endurance. To hold the Watch intact for one more season was victory enough. The title Lord Commander bore no dynasty, no crown to be inherited, no palace to gild their passage. Yet their burden was greater than most kings. They were in essence stewards of human memory, guiding not just men but the cause itself. The endless vigil, the oath made after the long night. Each crack of the wall's ice and winter storm, each howl of wolf or creak of bowstring, reminded them that they carried the weight of not only their brothers, but the living realms behind. To falter was not merely to fail men, but to imperil kingdoms. But even the strongest command cannot forestall time. Centuries wore at the Watch. Lord's Commander came and went, some glorious, some forgettable, some cursed. And as generations bled beneath black cloaks, the wall endured, but thinner, colder, more strained. The cracks were not in the ice, but within the Brotherhood itself. Numbers dwindled, castles closed, honor softened into punishment. The decline of the Watch crept slowly, quietly, like a long winter that at first feels survivable until it surrounds utterly. Thus, the chronicles of great Lords Commander give way to chapters far sadder. The Watch's long fall into neglect and disdain, a transformation from revered guardians to desperate remnants of men cast out by society. Their tale next becomes one of decline, disrepair, and the slow erosion of honor. Stretching for 300 miles across mountains and plain, the wall was no simple barricade of ice. It was its own world, and upon that frozen span once perched a scattering of castles, 19 standing strongholds in the earliest days. These were the way stations of vigilance, outposts of light, and sanctuaries of warmth in the unrelenting frost. Each was meant to serve as a fortress for brothers charged with patrols of their great barrier. In their fullest glory, these bastions housed thousands of men, smithies and stables smoking with the scent of work, halls echoing with the voices of black-cloaked guardians. But as time wore on, their stones cracked, their fires guttered, and their halls fell silent until the watch clutched to only 3. Castle Black, Eastwatch by the Sea, and the Shadow Tower. Castle Black, though humble in stone, lay at the wall's heart, a place of convergence and a fragile continuity. Unlike the grand keeps of the south, Castle Black held no great wall of its own. It lay open to the northern winds, constructed instead as barracks and halls huddled low upon the earth. Its strength came not from fortification, but from proximity to men, and from a black gate at the night fort of old. From Castle Black radiated the Brotherhood's fragile governance. The Lord Commander's chamber, the training yards where green recruits first felt weight of sword and shield, the rookery from which ravens were dispatched to Winterfell and far beyond. In the fullness of time, it became the symbolic heart of the Watch, its modesty testifying to the order itself. Frail in worldly finery, vast only in purpose. To the far east stood Eastwatch by the Sea, its walls battered by salt waves and its fires guiding ships through bitter storm. Here the Brotherhood maintained its only harbor, where black-cloaked men could provision themselves from ships carrying grain and men come reluctantly north. In later ages, when land support faltered from southern kings, Eastwatch became lifeline, for through those docks the Watch clung to faint hope. It also carried mythic weight, for here patrols rode upon white shores and gazed not into tangled woods, but into open sea. Tales lingered that watchers sometimes spied frozen shores on the distant horizon of their sight. Whether truly land or mirage, none could swear. Eastwatch felt both the end of the known world and a doorway into whatever lay across endless waters. To the far west stretched the Shadow Tower, built where wall and mountain met. It was a somber post, hemmed in by the cavernous ridges of the Frost Fangs. Its stone towers clamped about narrow passes through which enemies might pour southward unseen. The Shadow Tower's brothers lived cloistered against storms more fierce than those howling across plains. They were men of hard endurance, shaping themselves as weathered as the stone around them, often isolated from other castles by snows that could bury roads to impassable depths. In its lonely halls, the oath rang all the more stark. Their bond were not to lords or yield of land, but only to one another. But there were more once. The night fort, vast and terrible, haunted by echoes of darker days, had been the first of the Watch's castles. It boasted halls large enough to feed thousands, and in truth it symbolized the power of the Order in ancient times. Yet it was abandoned when ghosts of legend attached to its shadow, its kitchens whispering of horrors, and its steps burdened with the legacy of the Night King. Today, crows refuse to roost there. Then there have been Icemark, Deep Lake, Rhymegate, Oakenshield, and Stone Door, names remembered only in broken stones and frozen ruins. They fell not in grand battles, but in silence, as the Watch dwindled, lacking men to garrison so many keeps. Without fires, castles rot even faster than wooden shacks. Roof beams collapsed, gates rusted, and what still became barely more than carcass for owls and snow. The 20 towers of the wall, like candles extinguished in steady line, left only 3 flickering flames in a universe of night. Still, even collapsed ruins told stories. Brothers who were forced upon ranging off in shelter within gutted halls, scratched their names on cold stones as meager witness to their passage. Among the free folk, ruins were avoided, believed cursed or haunted by cold shadows. In truth, those ruins testified not of other sorcery, but a human neglect, the slow, tragic unmaking of an institution that once seemed immortal. Through these strongholds the Watch defined its structure. Each castle once housed stewards, builders, rangers, branches without which the Brotherhood could not endure. Together, the 19 had been envisioned as nets stretched wide across the frozen frontier, 1,000 lamps to burn back the dark. But centuries dulled them into only 3 frail beacons burning still. And yet from those 3, lonely, battered, underpopulated, the great moments of later centuries would unfold. Raids would surge southward to smash upon Castle Black's wall-less stones. Rangers from the Shadow Tower would vanish forever into the Frostfangs. And from Eastwatch's docks, ravens and rumors would sail out to sea, carrying word that perhaps the legends of old were waking once more. Thus the ruins of the Wall's stronghold serve as a reminder, more eloquent than any song, of what was once dreamed, an impregnable line of men in flame and duty. Their broken stones declare how hope decays not with sudden death, but with slow erosion, one unmanned post at a time. And from this landscape of decay arises the strangest paradox. Even at its weakest, with 3 castles instead of 19, the oath endured. What could this mean, except that perhaps the words carried more strength than stones? Yet words could not stop hunger, nor the steady decline that would strike both castles and men. Thus, inevitably, the chronicle bends toward the withering of the Watch itself. Its numbers thinned, its honor blunted. Where once kings and lords gave sons freely toward the Black, they began instead to send criminals, exiles, and unwanted bastards. The change reshaped the institution's marrow, and though duty still burned among some, it grew difficult to know whether the Watch guarded the realm or simply clung to survival. The Night's Watch was never shattered in some single calamitous moment. No grand battle toppled it, no fortress stormed, no decree erased its vows. Rather, its decline crept like frost across a window, slow, subtle, unnoticed until the pattern had consumed all clarity. For thousands of years, the Brotherhood had stood proud. Chosen sons of noble houses, volunteers who sought glory and duty, veterans who regarded the oath as sacred honor. But time erodes faith as surely as waves gnaw stone, and memory fades quicker than ice under spring sun. When the others remained only rumor, and kings to the south wrestled for crowns, the Wall slowly ceased to be the solemn frontier of the realm, and became instead a convenient dumping ground. With each passing century, lords grew less willing to send their heirs, or even their kin. Once, a second son of Stark, Karstark, Umber, or Manderley might regard the Watch as an honorable destiny, a life worthy of story. But as feudal squabbles grew in intensity and dynasties prized every sword for their own wars, these families hoarded their sons close. And so, into the Watch were sent not heirs but criminals, murderers given choice of noose or wall, thieves caught in petty crime, who traded dungeon years for lifelong service, bastards too troublesome to keep near family keeps. Slowly, the marrow of the order thickened with men who had not chosen, but been chosen. And when vows are embraced by coercion, not belief, they weigh heavier upon the back. Discipline faltered. Desertion became common. Tales of abandoned patrols and mutinies whispered down the centuries. Rangers returned from barren ranges divided, brothers trusting less in fraternity and more in sharp suspicion. Where the oath had once promised equality and rebirth, for many it became sentence, a prison without iron bars, but with cold and hunger as constant guard. Material decline came with the spiritual crumbling. 19 castles along the wall dwindled to 3 manned outposts. The others slouched into ruin quietly, collapsing beneath the harsh patience of the elements. To keep garrisons at full strength, the watch required thousands, but numbers shrank into hundreds and then dwindled further. A garrison stretched so thin could cover only fragments of its territory. Maesters in their chronicles remarked often with clinical sorrow, the watch was not what it once had been. And yet, can blame truly rest upon the men alone? They stood thousands of leagues from power, relying on the crown's support that wavered. Across Targaryen centuries, the watch's fortunes rose and fell with royal interest. Some courts remembered their distant guardians and sent grain, gold, new recruits. Others scarcely acknowledged them at all. At times the watch survived more on Winterfell's steadfast link than on the Iron Throne's indifference. When dynastic wars tore the south, the wall's guardians were forgotten, left to watch still, their bellies empty, their fires dwindling. What purpose, southern lords wondered, when the others never came again. Decline drove changes to perception as much as reality. In taverns far south, to take the black grew into a sneer rather than blessing, synonymous with exile. Criminals conscripted into service spoke bitter tales, and generation by generation the honor, the oath dimmed, to where the cloak no longer impressed as noble sacrifice, but marked a man as outcast. Even language shifted. The black became derided as a cloak of shame, its wearers mocked as crow rather than night. Yet within this decay endured still sparks of the old order. Not every recruit came bound by chains or shame. Some still volunteered. Sons with no inheritance who desired usefulness, men who sought redemption from mistakes heavy upon conscience, some even drawn north by grim romance. A boy might still arrive eager to speak the words and find in the brotherhood strange family. Among the ruin, oaths continue to be sworn with sincerity. And in the mix of desperate criminals with rare noble-hearted volunteers, the watch reshaped into something harsher, rougher, but still grimly resilient. What it lacked in prestige, it gained in stubborn endurance. But the transformation left scars even in structure. Where once the role of Lord Commander was contested among Lord sons of peerless training, it became increasingly weighted with harsher voices. Those who led not through nobility, but through ruthless discipline. Mutiny and rebellion occasionally stirred, often settled in blood. Winters of famine broke weaker commanders into wasteful cruelty, strengthening only the most pragmatic. The watch lost its broader respect from southern realms, but its internal toughness thickened like callus upon scarred hands. The decline also echoed into lore. Ghost stories gathered about ruined castles, mutterings of curses upon the night fort, and ice mark told to justify abandonment. But truth rarely required sorcery. Truth was simpler. The watch was thinning, and it lacked the strength to man every outpost. In their neglect, ruin bred superstition. Just as the free folk whispered of haunted keeps, so too did the watch allow myth to cover silence. Each fallen stronghold became not sign of negligence, but of inevitable doom. Convenient to believe if inconvenient to live. At its nadir, the watch dwindled to less than 1,000 brothers. For an order meant to span centuries, such feeble numbers pronounced doom plainly. And yet, like the wall itself, it did not collapse. For even in age of ruin, through centuries of disinterest, the oath endured. Words can outlast decline, and the oath held men together even when barely holding breath. That stubborn vow, the same forsworn words whispered beneath stars, kept alive the identity long after the heart had atrophied. Decline, however, was not merely background to be pitied. It would become the stage upon which new figures emerged. For just as the Watch seemed ready to slip wholly into irrelevance, events would conspire to jolt it back into relevance once more. Messiahs, traitors, saviors, and usurpers, each would rise upon the weakened order not despite its decline, but because of it. When numbers shrink, every man's role grows heavier. When honor is questioned, those who hold a flame burn brighter. As the Watch stumbled onward, it shaped the crucible in which its later heroes and its later tragedies would be forged. And so the ruin of the Watch opens into the grimmer chapters, where the Brotherhood's decline is mirrored by the kind of men filling its ranks. Bastards, broken men, and chained criminals stepped into Black Cloak, and their presence remade the face of the Watch itself. When a wall of honor crumbles, what fills the breach is rarely glory. The Night's Watch, once a beacon of sacrifice where noble sons and volunteers sought dignity and service, became instead the refuge of discarded lives. Its ranks swelled not with chosen heirs or songs of gallantry, but with the unwanted, bastards unwelcome in their own bloodlines, criminals spared the headsman's blade, debtors fleeing chains, and broken men wandering nowhere else to go. This transformation did not occur suddenly. It unfolded across centuries like the slow settling of rot into timber, each generation sending fewer proud recruits until Brotherhood's lifeblood became what the realm most sought to expel. For lords in Westeros, the Wall offered convenient judgment. Murderers, thieves, and rapists represented stark choice, the noose or the black. Men staring at the blade, pleading for reprieve, found in the Watch a last lifeline. But the motives of survival seldom aligned with the spirit of sacrifice. Brothers who came in such a way bore little reverence for their oath. They muttered the words as prisoners mutter orders, not as believers bent on prayer. The effect upon the Brotherhood was inevitable. Where once the cloak was symbol of dignity, it became linked to the stink of chain gangs and bitter defiance. Around these unwilling brothers strode the bastards. The social fabric of Westeros had always treated those born outside wedlock as lesser, useful tools perhaps, but seldom heirs, seldom recognized with honor. To them, opportunity south of the Wall was often limited. But north of the Wall, where lineage was stripped at the gate, they could at least rise, in theory, by merit. Many such men did. Yet their presence also made the Wall a place stamped with stigma. Bastards of noble houses walked beside criminals, neither wanted nor welcomed in the greater realm. The Watch became a holding ground for half-sons and unwanted kin, further shifting perception of dishonor. Yet even among such ranks, there was strange resilience. For though many arrived unwilling, the life beyond the Wall forged unity from those cracked stones. Shared cold and hunger bound them. Those who resisted discipline seldom survived. Many began their service with resentment, only to find themselves slowly shaped by the oath. Not all. Deserters always haunted the expanse. But more than one criminal, once scorned, hardened into a ranger whom comrades relied upon. The Wall had a way of burning away illusions, leaving only iron or ash. Still, the transformation altered the Watch's reputation irrevocably. To southern kingdoms, it ceased to symbolize guardianship but became exile. Take the Black became less oath than sentence. Taverns far from the Wall whispered only mockery. Whores and cut purses sent north to rot in snow, never be seen again. For common folk, cloaked men became half-shadows of doom, carrying with them the rumor of filth and failure. Even noble bastards, like those of Winterfell and White Harbor, struggled to find pride in the cloak that once symbolized honor. This decline reshaped the very hierarchy of the Watch. Stewards, rangers, builders, all found themselves training men with little aptitude or little belief. Patience frayed, beatings grew common, At the same time, the structure of equality within the Watch simplified into brutal necessity. Brothers who proved discipline, regardless of birth, could rise. In this harsh crucible, the notion of meritocracy was paradoxically sharpened by the shift in demographics. A thief could grow into a ranger. A murderer might one day command. But this leveling was not born of philosophy. It was the outcome of dwindling numbers, raw need overpowering disdain. Some broken men arrived not as criminals, but as wanderers, veterans of southern wars, shattered by loss and unable to endure civilian life. To them, the wall offered grim escape. Many arrived hollow-eyed, their valor long behind them. Still, they carried use and seasoned hands, if only briefly before weariness overtook them. And though their spirits were weary, their presence added to the Watch's strange mosaic. A body of men more diverse and fractured than any army in the Seven Kingdoms. This mixture gave rise to tensions more volatile than the Watch of old. Criminals distrusted noble-born, bastards bruised beneath casual insult, broken veterans despised boys sent forth as punishment more than choice. Discipline came only with struggle, forged not from common cause, but from relentless need. The oath bound them, but thinly, the code did the rest. Perhaps the greatest cruelty of this new era was how generations forgot what the Watch had once been. Recruits of noble blood became rare enough that brothers themselves doubted tales of honor in its past. To stand the Watch became synonymous with disgrace, and little more. And yet, when raiders came south, they were driven back. When storms froze roads, the Watch still lit fires. When shadows stirred in snow, it was the Black brothers who walked. Even in decline, even with criminals and cast-offs, still the duty endured. Here blooms paradox. The very men the world refused became those holding the wall. The dishonored guarded the realm that dishonored them. It is perhaps the strangest achievement of the Night's Watch, that even at its weakest, staffed by men unloved or unliving in memory, it remained what it promised to be, a line of vigilance between south and north, between warm and cold. But no wall of ice or oath of honor is immune to time. The Watch endured as prison and monastery, as exile's commune and bastard hall, and in its persistence it remained functional though tarnished. Yet into this frailty new forces emerged, questions the Brotherhood never thought it must face, including the lingering absence of half the world's population, women, whose exclusion marked the Watch as profoundly as the bastardy of its recruits. And so in the pages of its story, silence becomes thunderous, for the Watch was a brotherhood only, and in that denial of daughters and wives, another story brews. The wall has always been spoken of as a brotherhood, as if the long frost itself demanded only men shoulder its burden. But silence can leave deeper shadows than presence, and the absence of women from the Night's Watch is itself one of the most telling aspects of its long history. For though no woman has ever been counted among the Cloaks of Black, their presence lingered nonetheless, in memory, in lore, in influence, and in the haunting recognition of what was denied. At its conception, the oath stripped men of bloodlines, of legacy, of wives, of children. I take no wife, father no sons, words repeated through frost and fire. From the first forming of the Brotherhood, that renunciation was statement of purity, but also of exclusion. A life of celibacy demanded structure, discipline, and single purpose. Yet wrapped within it was a choice never confessed, that women's presence would distract or weaken or divide. From then forward, the wall became not just an institution of guardianship, but of masculine isolation. The result was a society wholly unlike the land south. Women feature in Watch chronicles most often as absence. Letters from mothers unanswered, lovers abandoned, daughters unacknowledged by fathers who had chosen the Black. In the annals of Castle Black, There is an entire vocabulary of silence around family, as if to speak of such ties risked weakening the oath's power. And a brother caught consorting was branded an oath-breaker. The punishment was death, yet absences echo. While no women swore the black, there remained figures of lore on both sides of the wall. Among the watch, tales spread of the Night King's queen, the pale woman with eyes like frozen pools whose presence nearly shattered the order. To free folk, female figures shone with defiance and story. Spearwives who fought as hard as any warrior, mothers who led their clans, lovers and chieftains shaping destiny directly. It is telling that while the Watch renounced women, the free folk embraced them, permitting them to guide raids, lead bands, and even claim kingship's mantle beside their men. Still, women's influence made itself felt within the Watch, if quietly. Noble houses who sent sons to the wall often did so by counsel of mothers who, in their silence, guided fates. Wives and daughters in the South bore the brunt of absence. Their care often would allow noble lords to send kin away. And in later centuries, when southern kingdoms sent criminals north, it was often mothers and sisters whose pleas and bargains kept those condemned alive long enough to reach the wall. Their presence in the background of the Brotherhood was unacknowledged but vital. Then there were the women in proximity, those at Mole's Town, a small settlement south of Castle Black, where taverns and brothels formed a shadow institution. Though the vows forbade wives and children, they could not stifle desire itself. Mole's Town's women, often small folk of the north, sometimes cast off themselves, became intertwined with the order. Brothers sought their company in secret. Some fathered children despite oaths, and whispers carried of bloodlines continued in quiet across the countryside. This, too, shaped perception, that for all the words spoken in solemn tone by torchlight, men could break upon the sharper edge of longing. Mole's Town became the unspoken counterweight to the oath, unofficial and disreputable, but always present. The Watch's relationship to women stood also as mirror to its southern patrons. South of the wall, queens ruled kingdoms and guided dynasties. The faith of the Seven venerated the mother among its holiest aspects. The North remembered old Nan's tales as fiercely as it remembered Winterfell's kings of snow. Yet in the Watch, women became either mythic figures demonized, such as the Night King's spectral queen, or marginalized shadows in stories of need and neglect. They were never permitted to stand among equals. This exclusion shaped identity itself. The Watch hardened into hierarchical masculinity, priding itself upon sternness, denial, a fraternity bound not by kinship of family, but by the deliberate suspension of it. To be one of the brothers was to live without half of humanity, a choice whose echoes produced discipline but also brittleness. Brothers often both scorned and longed for womanhood, sublimating that loss into cold camaraderie and rough humor. The fellowship gained was real, but the silence around women made it all the more rigid. In the end, the story of women in the Watch is a story of what was denied: affection, lineage, softness, balance. Their absence sharpens the tragedy of the Brotherhood's decline. For had the Watch weathered decline as a truly inclusive people, perhaps its numbers and morale would not have withered so thin. Instead, sealed away from half the realm's strength, the Watch tightened inward, becoming both purer and weaker. Its vow remained its marrow, but it was also chains, binding it not only to vigilance but to exclusion. Even then, women remained at the edges. In the mothers who wept when their sons swore the black, in the singers' tales of spearwives, in the lovers forsaken, and in the ghostly queen whose name was never spoken. This silence, this absence, gave shape to all that followed, even in decline. And it was precisely within these fractures, harsh masculinity, neglect, dwindling support, that the Watch's resilience would soon lean ever more heavily upon the divisions of rank within itself. For when men could no longer be bound by honor alone, it was structure that was called upon to preserve them. The orders of service, builders, rangers, stewards, became not merely roles, but lifelines holding the brotherhood together. The wall was more than ice and oath. It was also machinery, and human machinery must be ordered. As the Night's Watch endured century after century, its survival rested not only in the sword arms of its men, but in the strict separation of their duties. Out of this necessity grew the three great orders within the Watch: the Rangers, who walked the wild without fear; the Builders, who preserved the wall itself and the castles cradling its base; and the Stewards, keepers of daily life, without whom neither sword nor hammer could keep fire burning. Together, they formed a triad as old as the Watch itself, sustained across thousands of winters by ritual and memory. The Rangers became the Watch's most storied branch. They ranged beyond the wall into endless snow, vanished for weeks, sometimes months, returning with tales of rivers frozen into jagged spears, forests where silence could crush the heart, and free folk camps bristling with defiance. Rangers were both eyes and edge. It fell to them to locate raiders before they struck across the border, to mark trails through wastelands where storms erased paths within hours, and, when need arose, to fight, to spill blood in quick, furious engagements scattered across centuries. Their role gave them fierce stature. To serve as ranger was to walk constantly against death, and the best among them grew into legends sung even by their enemies. Yet the casualty of such glory was grim. Many never returned, and of those who did, many carried scars deeper than flesh. The Watch's songs and tales are filled with rangers whose courage was sharpened by loneliness, and whose fates often ended among cairns of stone the snow quickly covered. The Builders were less sung, but no less essential. Their charge was to preserve the very wall itself, a structure so massive that each new frost threatened collapse if not tended. They were masons and carpenters, blacksmiths and engineers, taming ice into permanence. They carved steps into the wall's face, raised elevators of timber and rope that creaked in the wind like groaning whales, and ensured gates were mended against eternal pressure storm. They mended keeps as well, strengthening what meager garrisons the brothers still manned, raising barricades after fire and stone, and building cairns for the uncounted dead. Their hands seldom clasped sword by choice, but when the wall itself became battlefield, they fought shoulder to shoulder like any brother. Their work, far less heralded than the Rangers, was the marrow of the Watch's endurance. Without it, ice would crumble, wood would rot, stone would sink into frost. The Stewards completed the triad. They were the glue that bound vigilance and stone together into living flesh. Cooks who simmered stews of onion and barley to keep bellies warm. Hunters who tracked deer for venison. Smiths who sharpened blades worn thin by endless practice. Scribes and maesters who bore the quills, setting ink to parchment to record struggles others would soon forget. Stewards included those who tended ravens, voices and lifelines to the rest of the world. Some were conscripted into such duty because they lacked the strength for ranger service, yet found purpose in tasks vital for survival. Others were chosen deliberately, such as when a boy's deft hand with quill or judgment with numbers made him too valuable to waste at the spear point. To southern nobility, stewardship sometimes appeared lesser than rangerhood, but in truth it carried its own burden of pride. Without the steward's care, cold and hunger would have thinned the Watch centuries earlier. It was not only the division of labor that preserved the Watch, but also the knowledge that any man might rise through ranks within his order by merit alone. The Lord Commander was chosen not from blood, but from trust. Beneath him, the first ranger embodied the martial frontier. The Lord Steward maintained lifeblood of the order, and the Lord Builder preserved its foundations. This council of 3 pillars supported the authority of command, balancing sword, stone, and hearth. The relationship between these offices was never easy, often tugging in different directions. Rangers pleaded for more men on patrol, while builders argued for labor upon crumbling walls, and stewards warned of dwindling rations and overstretched larders. It was in settling these disputes that the true skill of each Lord Commander was tested. The presence of maesters within the Watch added another layer of survival. Sent from Old Town, maesters bore chains of knowledge that stretched from healing herb to ravenry, astronomy to history. A Watch without a maester was blind in many regards. They tended wounds, taught letters to boys, measured the seasons with studious anxiety, and preserved lore which otherwise would have vanished forever into flame or frost. Yet their counsel, like their chains, bound them to skeptical empiricism. When brothers spoke of others, of blue-eyed corpses and half-glimpsed shadows in the snow, maesters often dismissed such reports as fancies born of cold. In this tension lay one of the great contradictions of the Watch, a brotherhood founded to defend against half-legendary beings, mistrusted by the very scholars meant to guide them. The 3 orders endured across centuries, even as the Watch declined. Rangers fell more often in battle, yet still they were sent, for without them the Watch would grow blind. Builders dwindled as castles were abandoned, for work upon 19 strongholds could not continue when only 3 remained manned, and stewards, burdened doubly in decline, struggled to feed more mouths with fewer resources, stretching oat and onion into meals thinner than broth. Still, the structure survived, so deeply embedded within the Brotherhood's marrow that even at its weakest, when numbers fell to fewer than 1,000 scattered men, the division continued unbroken. This structure, if nothing else, gave the Watch its continuity. When honor waned, when prestige collapsed, order still bound them. It trained recruits into defined roles. It kept rations measured, walls shuttered, patrols charted. And when fights broke out among unwilling convicts and surly bastards, it gave them ladders up which to climb. For however corrupted in morale, the Watch could still find merit within duty. That was its salvation, however fragile. When history turns toward its later struggles, toward great ranging expeditions, toward confrontations with kings beyond the wall, toward the final reckonings of Jon Snow, these orders loom behind every act. The Rangers' reports, the Builders' repairs, the Stewards' rations. These daily labors bound the Watch together while the realm forgot them. And it was from this shadow of half-strength and weary order, still preserved but fragile, that the Brotherhood attempted the last of its great alliances with southern crowns. Rare, fleeting, often betrayed, these alliances marked another stage in the Watch's long diminishing flame. For even the greatest order of swords cannot endure without the world behind it. The Night's Watch, though it crowned itself with words of independence, "It shall not end until my death. I am the sword in the darkness," was never wholly beyond the reach of politics. The wall's survival depended, for all its frozen grandeur, on men and food, and those could not be conjured from frost. They had to be given. So, across centuries, uneasy arrangements bound the Watch to the southern realm it claimed to serve without allegiance. The kings of the north, the lords of Westeros, and later, the dragon lord seated upon the Iron Throne. These bonds of obligation and reliance were as crucial as the wall itself, and as bled through with tension. In its earliest centuries, the Night's Watch had been held high within the esteem of the kings of winter. The Stark rulers saw themselves not merely as liege lords, but as kin to the Brotherhood, for often they sent their younger sons to join in service. In those days, the relationship was not patronage, but partnership. Starks provided grain, men, and steel, while the Night's Watch offered the north a veil of safety between its villages and the chaos of the wilds. This bond gave the Watch stability while it was still young, as reliable as the Stark words themselves. But as centuries stretched, the Stark crown diminished, replaced by Southern unity under Aegon's conquest. Where once the Watch had answered directly to Winterfell's kings, it was now, in theory at least, in service of the whole realm of Westeros. And here began the strange estrangement. Kings in distant King's Landing, enthroned in summer gardens, nodded toward the frozen north only when convenient. Some Targaryen kings remembered the oath their banners owed the Watch and sent coin, weapons, and men. Others treated the Black Cloaks as half-phantoms, useful for stories but unworthy of serious attention. From their towers, maesters kept record of these shifting tides with cool precision. During the reign of Jaehaerys the Conciliator, the Watch enjoyed fair provision. Eastwatch flush with supplies sent up from Gulltown and the southern ports. But in the wake of civil wars, Blackfire rebellions, and later the Wars of Succession, the Watch often found itself starved, depending on nothing more than the North's charity. There were times when the young sons of the Reach outnumbered the Northmen in its castles, and times when the trickle of recruits shrank so much that brothers arrived shackled from dungeons rather than knightly halls. Kings, even well-intentioned ones, saw the Watch as abstraction, for thousands of leagues stood between them and the wall's shadow. Courtiers muttered about the others as nursery tales, treating the Watch as a convenient trash heap in which to dispose of troublemakers. Few crowns dedicated thought or care until crisis loomed. And here lay one of the Watch's greatest burdens, which bled through into bitterness. Their very purpose required memory, but their patrons preferred forgetting. There were also times of direct royal intervention. Several Targaryens, sensing the Watch's plight, visited themselves. Queen Alysanne, beloved wife of King Jaehaerys, flew north upon her dragon Silverwing, her presence more poignant than any royal charter. She saw the wall with her own eyes, speaking with the Black brothers and hearing their plight. It was she who forbade the planting of new keeps within the gift too near the wall, preserving land for the Watch and granting them swaths of territory known as the New Gift. A concession meant to provide farms and tides. Her sympathy gave hope and briefly bolstered resources. But even such kindness slipped into erosion when generations later her decrees lay forgotten. Farmers returned, and the Watch was left pleading anew. Alliances were seldom stable, always contingent. Winterfell, almost alone among southern powers, remained constant in its support. Even so, there were limits to what the lords of the North could provide when their own people starved in long winters. When Stark lords rode consult at Castle Black, they brought honor, sometimes sons, but seldom enough men to restore the Watch to former glory. The reality remained. The Black Brotherhood's survival was ever chained to benevolence beyond its control. Resentment crept into the Watch's marrow with each broken promise. Caravans meant to arrive did not. Recruits pledged in law were quietly diverted to other wars. Men who should have stood vigil at the wall were sent instead to bleed on fields from the Trident to the Blackwater, while the Watch's numbers dwindled. Southern lords turned exile into utility. Instead of sending sons, they sent murderers. Instead of coin, they sent excuses. Even the proud words of the oath could not hide this theft of faith. Yet alliances, fragile though they were, gave the Brotherhood breathing space enough to endure when it otherwise might have withered. Supplies arrived just in time more than once. Noble families, still clinging to something of the old faith, occasionally sent offspring willingly. The Targaryens' dragons themselves, by their symbolic patronage, reminded the realm to glance northward, and the faith, though often indifferent, sometimes spoke of taking the Black as redemption, a core between holy penance and frozen duty. Then came the later kings, Baratheons and Lannisters, whose attention proved even more fleeting. Few recall their names at the wall, save as marks of neglect. Oaths had been traded for empty tribute, memory traded for convenience. Only when true crisis stirred, with the rise of Mance Rayder's unified host pressing southward, did the realm begin once more to think of its long-forgotten outpost. By then it was nearly too late. The fragile core between Crown and Brotherhood had frayed to little more than thread. What this long history of alliances reveals is tragic irony. The Watch was created to preserve all mankind against its darkest night. Yet the men it preserved seldom returned the favor. And still, out of stubborn defiance, the Watch endured. It clung to alliances even when they faltered, adjusted when crowns ignored them, bore humiliation and neglect with mute endurance. Their survival was, in its own way, an accusation. For why should men so discarded still guard realms that barely remembered them? And yet they did, faithfully. Yet neglect has consequences. For when alliances with the realm strain thin, survival falls not on patronage but on confrontation. And if the southern kings failed to remember their guardians, there were those beyond the wall who never forgot them. The free folk did not fade into silence. They remembered the wall's shadow always, and among them rose leaders who sought to break it. Leaders they named Kings Beyond the Wall. Each carried a story of defiance, each a challenge hammered against the wall's weakening face. And among them stood a man who would be remembered above the rest, for his rise brought crisis greater than any since the long night. The free folk, who named themselves proudly as such and were dismissed as wildling by the South, were never without leaders. Yet from time to time, a figure arose among them whose charisma and strength bound the scattered tribes together under one mantle. These were their great war kings, the kings beyond the wall, who sought not just survival in valleys and forests, but dominion, however brief, over all land south of the ice. Their names and deeds were carried across centuries, remembered in equal parts by Black Cape brothers and wildling singers. Gendel and Gorn, the storied Bale the Bard, Jarl the Bitter, Raymond Redbeard, and finally, in living memory, Mance Rayder. The earliest of these were born in ages still thick with legend. Gendel and Gorn, brothers by blood and ambition, forged together the first great march against the Watch's defenses. Their banners lured clans from the Frostfangs and beyond, their voices spilling songs of freedom and outrage. They sought passage not merely for pillage, but for land, greener fields, forests with prey, shelter from the crushing white. For a time, it seemed they might succeed. Ancient accounts speak of the brothers pressing their host all the way through the underground Black Gate beneath the Night Fort itself. And for weeks they haunted the foothills south of the wall, striking villages and scattering Northmen defenders. But the land itself betrayed them. Labyrinth caves collapsed, disunity snaked back into their ranks, and retreat consumed them faster than battle could. They vanished at last into caves where, legend insists, they linger even now, lost and wandering. A tale recited half as caution, half as ghost story for sleepy children. Later names emerge more clearly in song. Bale the Bard, half hero and half trickster, lived as much in tales as in fact. He was not merely fighter but singer, famed for cunning more than brute strength. Bale's most famous tale tells how he slipped into Winterfell by guile rather than arms, betting the Stark's own daughter, leaving behind a child who would carry both shame and legacy. To the Watch he was enemy. To the free folk he was a song of freedom made flesh, the embodiment of cleverness outshining iron. Such figures remind us the war between free folk and Watch was not only fought with spear, but with myth. For if the Watch's tales cast the others as eternal enemies, free folk tales cast the kings beyond the wall as eternal heroes of freedom denied. Other kings carried their ambition further, with fury sharpened into conquest. Raymond Redbeard led one of the largest hosts of free folk had ever mustered. His invasion fell upon the North centuries after Aegon's dragons had settled the Seven Kingdoms. Raymond's horde burned deep into Stark territory, even threatening the heart of Winterfell. The Black Brothers and their noble allies fought bitterly, but though Raymond's defiance was vast, it ended in blood. At the Battle of Long Lake, Northman forces crushed his forces utterly. Raymond himself fell, his red beard soaked in gore, remembered with both awe and grief by his folk. For the Watch, his fall was proof the wall still endured. For the free folk, it was tragedy, proof that even the mightiest king beyond the wall could not break through the Order's icy vigilance. The cycle repeated. A leader arose, tribes rallied, the Watch bled but endured, and disunity shattered the free folk once more. These kings bound proud identity into a crown, then passed into ruin as the crown slipped. For south of the wall, no power ever allowed them to linger long. So long as the Black Brothers stood and Northmen's spears stood behind them, kingship of the free was brief flare, inevitably extinguished by blood and famine. Yet in their persistence was strength. No matter how many hosts beyond the wall were slain, the dream returned. Generation after generation, tribes remembered Raymond, Bael, Jarl the Bitter, remembered not defeat but courage. For every fall of a king birthed a story, and stories endure longer than armies. And through centuries of endless failure rose at last one whose cunning cut sharper than sword. Mance Rayder was no outsider to the Watch, but one of its own, bore the very order sworn to guard against his future people. He was raised beneath its walls, wore its cloak, sang its songs. Yet he broke from the Brotherhood, deserting after years to emerge years later as the most formidable of free folk kings. Where others bonded tribes briefly, Mance held them together through skill and guile, uniting then's Hornfoot clans, cave dwellers, giants, raiders, spearwives. Under his banner, for the first time since Raymond Redbeard, the free folks' dream of passage south became reality, not as plunder, but survival. He did not rally them for conquest, but for escape, for behind them stir horrors greater than wall or watch. Mance's rise was a culmination of millennia of free folk struggle. His hosts stretched in numbers that dwarfed supporting Black Brothers, pressing upon Castle Black with thunderous inevitability. His strategy was more than fury. It was intelligence, patience, artistry. Even the Black Brothers, who spat at his desertion, could not wholly deny his cunning as king beyond the wall. Here, upon the weakened Watch, long diminished and fueled by criminals and bastards, his challenge became storm that threatened to break what stood since Bran's beginning. Thus, the long chronicle of Kings Beyond the Wall narrows its focus into the figure of Mance Rayder, the singer turned deserter turned king, whose invasion would mark one of the Watch's greatest reckonings, an echo of Long Night and Raymond's ruin alike. It was through him that the Watch, battered by centuries of neglect, would be forced anew into conflict larger than itself, and it was through him that the fate of one bastard boy, Jon Snow, became forever entwined with the legend of the Wall. The time came when the Watch, already thin to a brittle remnant in black, faced a choice it had hoped to delay forever: to act boldly beyond the Wall, or to dwindle into irrelevance behind their crumbling stones. The free folk had unified under the banner of Mance Rayder, and their numbers swelled greater than any host the Wall had ever seen in memory. Giants and spearwives, thens with bronze-shot axes, cave dwellers with crude blades, families huddling behind chieftains, all sharpened by hunger and fear. Yet their drive south was not conquest alone. It was survival, for behind them stirred the oldest terror. Rangers brought whispers of pale shapes moving among the blizzards, blue-eyed corpses hunting in silence. The stories long dismissed by southern lords were awakening again as fact. Maester Aemon, frail and blind but sharper in mind than most thrice his age, uttered the words his brothers dreaded. The others had returned. That truth meant that to remain behind the wall was to wait for ruin. Rangers, stretched desperately thin, could no longer vanish by handfuls without shattering the watch completely. Something had to be done. Thus Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, the old bear, shaggy, stern, and indomitable, called the Great Ranging. It was the largest expedition the Watch had attempted in centuries. Near 300 men, rangers foremost, builders, and stewards accompanying, all leaving Castle Black united beneath one will. Their aim was audacious: to march deep into the haunted forest, chart the growing threat, learn what truth lay behind the whispers, and if need be, strike at its heart before it struck them. The Great Ranging carried with it not only swords and torches but memory itself, echoes of elder days when commanders had led grand forays into wilds beyond count. Brothers polished their mail, swore anew their vows, and followed Mormont with an air half fear, half hope. Among them marched Jon Snow, still boy turned into man by necessity, bound to Mormont as steward and witness. Their progress was a dirge of cold futility. From Eastwatch to Frostfang, their paths grew thick with omens, half-buried skeletons of entire villages, slaughtered cattle whose flesh froze mid-rotting, camps fallen to eerie stillness. Beyond the fists of the first men, things sharpened into terror. The Ranging stumbled upon caches of dragonglass daggers and arrowheads, relics left by some hand long since vanished, as if ancient watchers had whispered across centuries to leave weapons behind. Deeper still, they passed cairns and markers where crows gathered in unnatural silence. Yet worse than omens was truth. The others were indeed risen, and their vanguard was silence made flesh. The White Walkers moving as frost shadows against moonlit snow, their hands trailing chill that unmade fire. Behind them came corpses risen, thralls of winter, wildlings and rangers both, their eyes glowing, their sword arms tireless even as wounds gaped. The Watch's worst nightmare breathed again. At the fists of the first men, the Great Ranging was broken. Hosts of the dead fell upon them in fury. Brothers were butchered, then lifted again to stand against their own kin. Only fragments survived, scattering toward the wall, carrying warnings and terror behind them. The expedition meant to strike boldly instead became flight for survival. The Great Ranging broke the Watch's pretense of decline into full crisis. Hundreds were lost, precious in a brotherhood, so few to begin with. Leadership faltered. Jeor Mormont himself, once the old bear who symbolized steadiness, would fall not in battle with white shadows, but to mutiny later at the hands of his own, broken by hunger and fear at Craster's Keep. The Watch, dragged into wilderness against enemies mythic and human alike, cracked deeper. The catastrophe revealed as clearly as words could not. The others were real. The age of disbelief had ended. Still, the Great Ranging's memory cut both ways. It was tragedy of lives lost, but also testament of endurance. Even in ruin, fragments returned. Samwell Tarly, once derided as craven, became slayer of an other with dragonglass, proof that legend could bleed and die. Jon Snow, witness to everything, carried lessons of command and betrayal, forging his own path forward. The disasters that scattered the Watch also birthed the leaders required for what followed. For when Mance's free folk tide pressed fully to the wall's foot, it was upon this wounded brotherhood that the assault would fall. And among them, the fractured survivors of the Great Ranging would hold knowledge that no one south of the wall believed until too late. The enemy of legend was flesh again, and their advance beyond the wall was not mere migration, but fleeing from storm far greater. Thus the failure of the great ranging became crucible. It ended not with triumph, but with broken swords, mutiny, corpses risen in desperate retreat. Yet without it, the Watch would not have understood the scale, nor would men like Jon Snow have endured their trial by frost. Survival, then, was its bitter legacy, for into fire and blood from its ashes would burst the battles that decided the Watch's fate. So the great ranging closes its chapter not in triumphal clarity, but with grim inevitability, its shadows falling long over what came next. For if the expedition laid bare the other's return, it also ensured the Watch would stand broken and undermanned at the very moment it needed all strength. And when Mance Rayder's vast host of free folk surged to crash against the wall, the edge of survival stood on the blade of a boy not yet fully grown. The boy who rode north of the wall sought belonging as much as service. Jon Snow, Bastard Winterfell, came wrapped in both pride and shame. Pride in his Stark blood, shame in his surname that branded him outsider even in hearth he had grown within. The wall, he believed, offered rebirth, a place unchained from inheritance where oaths, not bloodlines, determined worth. What he found was not honor clothed in black, but a place that convicts bitter men and reluctant recruits. Yet precisely because of his decay, the Night's Watch shaped him. At first, Jon carried the arrogance of noble upbringing, thinking his skill with sword and his Stark name marked him as greater than those who stood beside him. Poachers, rapers, broken men. He bested them swiftly in training, but failed to see that by humiliating them, he was isolating himself. It was a gentle reminder of Donal Noy, the smith who had once forged Robert Baratheon's warhammer, that cut through his pride. Noy told him he fought like a lordling but lived among outcasts, and if he wished to survive the wall, he must learn to see them as brothers. It was in that moment Jon began to shift, from boy to man, from loner to brother. His companions became the stones upon which he built new identity. Samwell Tarly, coward turned courageous in devotion, Gren, PYP, and Dolorous Ed, whose coarse humor couched fierce loyalty. These brothers were not Starks, not lords, yet they gave Jon what Winterfell's shadows never had, equality born of shared purpose. Within the barracks and forest, Jon discovered that family might be forged even from cast-offs, bound not by blood but by vow. As steward to Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, Jon found himself placed where his pride first bristled but later flourished. To serve as Mormont's squire felt like insult, yet was, in truth, a test. Through daily service, measuring supplies, tending ravens, speaking with leaders, Jon acquired what sword could not grant, understanding of command. The old bear, as he was named, became strange father to him, gruff, at times cold, but forged from truth of duty. Through Mormont, Jon glimpsed the weight of leading broken men, the duty of decision when every path led into blizzard. Mormont's unwavering discipline hardened Jon into something sterner than boyhood ever promised. But it was in choices, not in training, that Jon's character solidified. He was tested thrice in loyalty, to lord, to vow, to heart. His first trial came when he heard word of Ned Stark's beheading in far King's Landing. Rage and grief nearly lured him into abandoning his oath, to ride south and take vengeance. Only with the counsel of his companions did he realize that to desert the Watch for vengeance would dishonor both his father's memory and himself. His second test rose when he joined the great ranging and saw the frailty of both oath and man. Surrounded by despair, threatened by corpse and shadow, Jon learned that standing firm meant sacrifice without certainty of reward. The third and greatest test came among the free folk, captured by wildling forces, Jon found himself drawn into their raw spirit of freedom, their lack of deference, their refusal to kneel. In their midst burned Ygritte, the spear wife whose laugh melted his certainty. She taught him the way to choice more than Mormont or even the Stark name had. For to love her was to break vow, but to betray her was to break heart. In Ygritte and the wildlings, Jon saw humanity, not monstrous caricature. He understood that the great wall between them was not only ice, but the illusions men had carved to justify separation. This was lesson heavy enough that even after choices were made, after her death in battle, Jon never forgot it. Through these trials, Jon grew not just into a man of the Watch, but into its unlikely voice for transformation. Unlike most who viewed free folk as simple enemies, Jon recognized they were kin, desperate to survive the same storms. Unlike most who saw command as privilege, Jon grasped as burden. Unlike most who sought personal legacies, Jon came to see himself as servant of survival itself. The bastard boy had come to the wall seeking belonging. What he found was truth harsher than he imagined. The Watch was shattered, broken, brittle as melting ice. Yet he also found in its desolation chance to carve his own identity beyond Stark or Snow. Within the wall's shadow, Jon moved from outsider to brother, from steward to commander-in-waiting. Through steel, oath, love, and loss, his fate entwined with fate of the Brotherhood itself. And it would be upon Jon, a boy of bastardy who believed first in honor, then learned to compromise, that the night fell hardest. For when Mance Rayder pressed with his horde of free folk upon the wall, the fate of thousands would fall not upon kings or queens, but upon the bastards, criminals, and broken men of the Watch, and upon one boy grown into man, standing at Castle Black's heart with oath carved into his chest like scar. When the host of Mance Rayder converged upon the wall, history itself seemed to lurch forward with the force of inevitability. For centuries the Brotherhood had muttered of myths, trained against shadows, and held its vigil through decline and ridicule. Yet here, in the dead heart of a northern winter, all those slow centuries of attrition broke against the storm of a people united beneath one banner. Giants and mammoths, spear wives and chieftains, bowmen and raiders. Families pressed forward beside warriors. For this was no mere marauding army of plunder. It was a migration, a desperate tide. Behind them stalked death itself in forms they could no longer withstand. Before them loomed the wall, 17 leagues of ice and ancient silence. And upon that frozen barrier clung only a handful of black brothers, scarcely numbering above a few hundred, weakened, starving, fractured by desertion and mutiny. It should have been no contest at all. The free folk had gathered more weapons, more tribes, more resolve than any king beyond the wall before them. The Watch had never been so weakened. Yet trivial odd in human arithmetic sometimes fail against discipline, desperation, and the unyielding cruelty of terrain. Above all, within Castle Black was stirred that refused to yield. Jon Snow, risen from steward to reluctant captain, and alongside him men who, whatever their crimes or failings, now had nowhere to run but into legend. The battle unfolded in two fronts, pressing from south and north alike. For Mance was cunning. He sent his southern raiding host across the Gift to strike Castle Black from behind, while his main hosts hurled themselves at the wall's stone and ice. Castle Black itself, as a keep, was woefully unfit. Low palisades, towers few, open to assault. But the wall itself proved truer fortress. Atop its 700-foot face, barrels of pitch and crude defenses became engines of annihilation when loosed upon giants straining to break its desolate gates. One giant in full fury, astride a mammoth of terrifying scale, shattered forth to reave destruction. Yet there in frozen midnight, a handful of rangers stood their ground, loosing arrows, hurling flames, and finally sacrificing their lives to hold the gate. The courage of men like Gren, illiterate farm boy turned brother, was etched into the marrow of the Watch in that moment. With the gate shaking beneath giant assault, he and his companions held their oath of blood, chanting the words together even as they fought their last. When the mammoth and its towering rider fell, so too did those brave brothers, but their stand ensured Castle Black did not fall that night. Meanwhile, upon the ground south of the wall, Jon's leadership began to blaze. His command was not adorned with crown nor inherited right, but forged in swift necessity. With the old bear dead and Ser Alistair Thorne grievously wounded in defense, Jon found himself bearing a mantle he had never claimed. He took instinct, courage, and the hard lessons of Mormont and Ygritte alike, and turned them into resolve. Men followed him because they had no choice. They continued to follow because his certainty in chaos was truer than their own fear. Wave after wave, the free folk pressed. Arrows darkened skies. Ladders splintered. The cries of the dying filled the forests. Yet for every raider who scaled, 2 were hurled down by boiling pitch or shattered upon stone. Where numbers failed to watch, the wall itself triumphed, acting as silent ally. Impossible to climb without blood, impossible to breach without endless sacrifice. Even then, it was will that tilted scales. For while Mance's host fought for flight from the dead, the brothers fought for oaths that allowed no retreat. Between desperation and devotion, the clash birthed carnage unmatched since the oldest lays of the Watch. Jon's heart, however, lay further broken by the woman he had loved. Ygritte, fierce spearwife of the free folk, was among those storming Castle Black. By the cruel hand of fate, her arrow never struck him. Instead, she felt a shaft loosed by another. In the chaos of battle, she died in Jon's arms, the woman whose laughter had taught him the wildling's truth. Her death mingled with victory's ashes. Proof that no matter the outcome, the wall devoured love and life alike. At Castle Black, the war was never clean triumph but bitter survival. After nights of slaughter, exhaustion, and endless howls from beyond the Treeline, the free folk tide still threatened to overwhelm. The Watch had held the wall itself, yes, but Mance's numbers dwarfed them still. The final breaking stroke was not delivered by starving brothers, but by the arrival of southern steel. For Stannis Baratheon, claiming crown under southern sun, brought his host northward by sea and storm, and his knights crashed into free folk, hosts at the very moment of likely Watch collapse. Fire and steel scattered Mance's tribes, capturing their king and breaking the host that had nearly shattered the wall. Thus the battle for the wall ended not in definitive victory of black brothers, nor in conquest of free folk, but in intervention from a crown that had, until then, all but forgotten the Watch. History recorded that Jon Snow and his bleeding brothers held through nights of impossible odds, that giants fell, that kings knelt, and that the wall endured once more. But the deeper truth lingers. The battle was only pause, for the true storm lay still beyond. The battle for the wall reshaped not only the command of the Night's Watch, but its very identity. For out of its ashes, Jon Snow was recognized as leader of rare substance, even as southern kings eyed him warily. And for the free folk it was tragedy. The dream of passage into safety shattered again by southern thrones. Yet though captives filled Stannis' camps, Jon alone still held memory of Ygritte's words, and pity for people who warred not against men, but against cold death behind them. And so out of fire and ice, battle and blood, the Brotherhood staggered onward into its most unlikely age. The years in which Jon Snow, bastard brother turned leader, would be lifted to command as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Upon his shoulders would rest decisions no wall-born leader had ever faced. Decisions not merely about wildling raids, but about the survival of all humankind. When the blood had clotted on frost and the smoke from pitch barrels drifted into memory, the Night's Watch stood ragged but unbroken. Out of that ruin arose not some seasoned noble, nor a son of Winterfell's lordly line, but the bastard who had once arrived as half-boy seeking belonging, Jon Snow. The Wall has a cruel way of stripping men to truth, and for Jon it stripped every comforting mask, until command was thrust upon him with no fanfare, but with a weight of centuries on his shoulders. His election as Lord Commander was as fractured as the Brotherhood itself. The Watch had dwindled into factions. The old guard clinging to tradition, hard-bitten rangers who cared only for swords at the wall, and younger men, many of whom had fought beside Jon at Castle Black and remembered his valor. Against these stood Ser Alliser Thorne, bitter and scornful, representing the remnant of discipline so steeped in prejudice, it refused to see the free folk as anything but foes. And yet the deciding hand came not from the ranks of rangers, but from the quill of Maester Aemon, who with quiet wisdom cast his vote for Jon, tilting scales toward the boy-turned-commander. His appointment marked both rupture and renewal. Jon Snow's legacy rested upon one radical truth that set him against half his sworn brothers. He saw the free folk not as perpetual foes, but as kin, as men and women fleeing from a terror greater than history had prepared them for. Where centuries of lords commander judged success by how firmly they drove wildlings back into frost, Jon judged it by whether they survived alongside them. This choice, born of love lost and lesson scarred, reshaped the purpose of the Watch itself. His most controversial act was thus his boldest, opening the gates of the Wall to free folk, thousands of them, once enemies, now allies, if uneasy ones. He bartered with Stannis Baratheon to grant them land in the gift, where their axes in hands would defend the north instead of raid it. For brothers of the Watch, whose lives have been written for centuries upon spilled blood, defending against these same clans, it felt like betrayal. To Jon it was survival, for he had seen with his own eyes what stirred beyond. Others raising the dead, coal that quenched fire, hosts of whites numbering in endless swells. Against such enemies, stubborn grudges were vanity. Humanity's only hope lay in unity. This vision was ahead of its time, born of desperation but fueled by extraordinary clarity. Yet it carved enemies within his own camp. Brothers muttered he was more wildling than crow. Some whispered he wore his father's bastardry too openly, scornful of what loyalty could mean. And yet, despite their murmurs, Jon pushed forward, training the free folk, marshaling watchtowers, building fires along the wall, urging men to remember the oath, not to keep out wildlings, not to guard noble families, but to guard the realms of men. Politics pressed as harshly as winter. Stannis, commanding his southern army, camped long at the wall and pressed Jon with offers to leave the Watch and claim Winterfell, legitimized as stark with Stannis' decree. The temptation cut deep, for childhood dreams had always leaned toward name and place. But Jon chose otherwise, choosing not crown nor castle, but continued oath. In this refusal lay a transformation. His bastard's longing for legitimacy gave way to command's burden. He was no longer hungry for title. He was hungry only for survival. Even so, Jon's tenure as Lord Commander bore tragedy. For vision and politics seldom share a bedfellow easily. His outreach to the free folk grew into fissure between factions too deep to heal. To traditionalists like Bow and Marsh, his mercy was weakness, his warnings hysteria. The Watch, already scarred by famine and mutiny during the Great Ranging, was not easily bent toward compassion. Where Jon saw a common cause, others saw abandonment of ancient oaths. The outcome was assassination cloaked in pretense of fraternity. Brothers he had fought beside, men who had cheered him during election, turned knives upon him beneath the name of saving the watch. Betrayal does not come from enemy spears. It comes from brothers whose fear eclipses their loyalty. Yet Jon's command left legacy broader than his death. In symbol, he cracked the wall open, where once it divided peoples, now it became channeled passage. He demonstrated vision beyond grudges, embracing the vow in its truest, broadest sense. His reforms, however turbulent, displayed what the watch might have been had its decline not dulled it, and his choices became lesson for all who followed, that to win against despairing darkness, men must abandon narrow suspicion and embrace unity. Memory of Jon Snow's command lingers even in silence after betrayal. For though they struck him down, though black blades pierced his flesh, his legacy was not undone. The free folk were south of the wall because of him, alive when without him they would have perished in white storms. Men knew, even those who hated him most, that his choices came not from weakness but foresight. His story, like the wall itself, became less about endings and more about endurance. Survive another night, another storm, until dawn deem mercy. With Jon Snow ends not the watch's history, but its transformation. After him, never again would the wall be about mere border between men, never again about mere distinction between lords and wildlings. From his command onward, the tale of the watch shifted fully into tale of humanity's survival. His legacy, contested, bloody, betrayed, remains one of the last embers burning in the watch's long, dark saga. And as Jon laid bleeding beneath stars, the wall itself loomed yet vast and silent, but cracks spidered through its ancient face. For storms older than kings were gathering, and even the greatest barrier forged by mortal hands could not outlast forever. And so we turn to the twilight of the watch, the ruin, the breach, the silence after storm, when the wall itself, after 8,000 years of vigil, was broken. When ice breaks, it does not whisper. It groans, it sighs, it shatters like thunder rolling from the bones of the earth. For 8,000 years the wall had stood silent sentinel, its height a physical impossibility, encased in memory and spell. Yet in the end, the wall broke. Not to time, not to decline, but to a single great moment of invasion when the Night King, the pale rider half legend, half flesh, brought fire-wreathed ruin upon it with an undead dragon at his command. At Eastwatch by the sea, the unthinkable happened. The wall, foundation of the known world, screamed and fell. That collapse was not mere stone and frost. It was a breaking of all illusion. For centuries people south had laughed at fireside tales of others, mocked the watch as jailers of thieves. With the wall breached, those stories rose into reality too massive to deny. The barrier that had once preserved their forgetfulness was gone. The dead could march unimpeded, from frozen wastelands to green fields. The wall's fall was not an end, but the unveiling of truth. South of that devastation, the watch itself dwindled almost to echo. Brothers clung still at Castle Black and Shadow Tower, but their numbers, already spindled to mere hundreds, now stood shattered closer to dozens. The oath endured in whispers, but its guardianship meant little when the barrier itself lay cracked like an eggshell. Some might argue then that the watch had already failed, that it perished the moment a dragon's fiery frost seared its ancient defenses. Yet perhaps in truth their purpose was fulfilled exactly as Bran the Builder had intended. Not to survive forever, but a delay doomed long enough for mortals to face it. The war for the dawn, as it came again to be styled, was not held upon the wall, but in open lands beyond, and in Winterfell's halls, and in southern keeps where men and women finally realized their enemy knew neither borders nor oaths. Brothers of the Black fought in that storm not as rear guard, but as last guardians mingled among southern hosts. Their vows carried with them even into battles where no walls stood behind. Dolorous Ed, Gren, PYP, Samwell, and others, their courage remained embers glowing within broader storm. Jon Snow, raised from bloody knives into role far larger than one bastard at a wall of ice, carried the oath more furiously than any words could bind. In that shared war, the Brotherhood did not vanish. It melted into humanity's desperate stand. And when the storm passed, when Night King lay shattered and dead armies fell dust upon battlefields, the Watch looked northward to ruins of stone and ice. Its castles sagged into silence. Its godswoods watched wordless. The 19 strongholds reduced to 3 now seemed more tombs than forts, their halls empty of voices. But still, some men swore. For however hollow the wall's great barrier, the oath retained grim weight. Beyond, wild lands still stretched, hungry for those brave enough to wander. Even without others, raiding might return, and winter would always crawl south. Wilderness ever pressed, and the need for guardians never wholly perished. Yet in truth, the Watch after the war became more symbol than blade, an unfinished song rather than living army. Its decline had been long, its fall thunderous, and its afterlife spectral. Like ancient ruins whose stones hum with memory, so too did the Watch endure more as a reminder of the necessity. The great castles had become museums of courage and folly. The wall itself scarred, cracked with gaps that men patched in vain. But its ghost remained vital, a warning etched forever into story that neglect and arrogance invite ruin, and only vigilance steals survival. And so, the Watch's last identity became paradoxical. It was both ended and eternal, ended in numbers, in power, in relevance, eternal in words still spoken fading into frost. Oath that would outlast flesh, remembered even as sworn by only a handful of ragged souls. The Night's Watch became less shield than storyteller, less army than haunting. It stood in history like petrified tree, dead, yet shaping a landscape. What legacy then remains? That walls alone do not protect. Men and memory must live beside them. That kin divided by pride fall quickly, yet unified stand against cold. That bastards and criminals, forgotten by nobility, may stand too firm for death to break. Above all, that no foe is truly past. Winter's return, forgetting his peril's surest ally. Thus the wall, cracked and gutted, yet loomed in silence after the war with the dead was won. Snow fell across its ruins, smoothing broken ice, until once more it seemed eternal. Ravens wheeled in its shadow. Men still looked northward and shivered. The history of the wall is not merely architecture, not merely oath, but warning. Vigilance is the only fire that holds back night, and whether sworn by proud Lord Sun or nameless castaway, as long as even one voice chants those words in the freeze, the Night's Watch remains, not what it was, but what it must forever be, a fragment of humanities who are refusing to die. The wall stands now a scar upon the world, jagged and broken, yet luminous still against moonlight. Its shattered heights whisper more than soldiers ever could, of giants long past, of kings whose crowns were frost, of bastards who forged lineage from loyalty alone. Silence has returned to its abandoned castles. Gates hang crooked. Stables lie empty, hearts cold. Yet listen closely, and echoes remain. One can almost hear training swords clashing in frosty yards, or voices muttering oaths into the still night air. Time has softened the clangor into memory. Snow drifts as thick as feathers over battlements where no sentry lingers. In the ruins, ravens wheel above broken towers, their wings scattering whispers like hymns. And in frozen forests beyond, wind carries faint illusion, shapes moving between trees, perhaps shadows of brothers who once patrolled eternally, guarding their realms of men. But remembrance itself is a kind of survival. The wall was not meant merely to stand forever, but to teach, to etch vigilance into marrow. It warns that night always advances, that indifference and forgetting are as deadly as blades of ice. And though its stones lie fractured, the watch lives on in each tale told, in each oath whispered by dreamers who imagine frost and hear the faint chant of duty. So let the ruin rest. Let it slumber beneath star fields glimmering vast above, for in its silence is low and lesson alike. We are small things beneath endless dark, yet even the smallest may hold lamps alight against hungry night. The wall whispers this truth still, that while shadows fall eternal, courage rises too, and even in deepest winter, a spark of fire remains. And with that spark, night surrenders softly into sleep,